Truth is the foundation of existence. It is what allows us to navigate reality effectively, to understand the world, and to communicate with one another in a meaningful way. Without truth, we are lost, disoriented, and vulnerable to destruction. But demons, whether real, metaphorical, or psychological, do not simply lie. Lying is too simplistic, too crude. Instead, they twist truth itself. They manipulate reality in such a way that what was once clear becomes murky, what was once stable becomes unstable, and what was once known becomes unknowable. They do not merely deceive, they corrupt the very concept of truth, so that deception becomes indistinguishable from reality. This is one of the most dangerous and insidious aspects of malevolence. A lie is something that can be corrected, something that can be identified and refuted. But when truth itself is twisted, when the very fabric of language and meaning is distorted, the ability to recognize falsehood disappears. And when you cannot recognize falsehood, you cannot fight it. You become enslaved to a narrative that no longer reflects reality. A prisoner in a world where meaning has been rewritten to serve the interests of those who seek to control you. Look at history, at the regimes that have ruled through terror. They never begin with overt violence. Instead, they begin by twisting language. They change the definitions of words. They take concepts that were once understood and redefine them so that opposition becomes impossible. Freedom becomes slavery. War becomes peace. Ignorance becomes strength. This is not accidental. This is the strategy of those who wish to rule through deception. If you can manipulate language, if you can corrupt the way people think, then you no longer need to use force, because the people will police themselves, they will censor themselves, and they will accept the false reality they are given. The most effective demons do not need to tell outright lies. Instead, they use half-truths, carefully selected pieces of information, distortions of reality that are just close enough to the truth that they appear believable. They mix falsehood with truth so skillfully that the distinction between the two is erased. And once that happens, once people no longer know what is real and what is not, they can be led anywhere. They can be made to believe anything. This is why ideological possession is so dangerous. It does not simply persuade, it reprograms. When people become possessed by ideology, they no longer think critically. They no longer ask questions. Instead, they repeat slogans. They speak in prepackaged phrases, in rehearsed arguments that they did not generate themselves. Their words are no longer their own. They have been given to them by something else. And when someone ceases to think for themselves, when they allow an external force to dictate their beliefs, they are no longer an individual. They have become a mouthpiece for something else. Something that does not care for truth, but only for control. The twisting of truth is not only a societal problem, it is deeply personal. It happens in relationships, in families, in friendships. There are people who manipulate reality so skillfully that they can convince you that up is down, that right is wrong, that your own memories cannot be trusted. They gaslight you, making you question your own perception. They rewrite history so that past events never happened the way you remember them. They shift blame, twist narratives, and make themselves appear as victims even when they are the perpetrators. This is not just dishonesty. This is a war on reality itself. And when reality is under attack, the consequences are catastrophic. People who are trapped in this kind of manipulation become confused, anxious, uncertain. They doubt themselves. They lose confidence in their own judgment, and they become paralyzed. When you do not know what is true, you cannot act. And when you cannot act, you become powerless. This is why truth is not just an abstract concept. It is a moral obligation. It is a responsibility. If you allow truth to be twisted, if you permit deception to take root, then you are complicit in the destruction of reality. And when reality is destroyed, suffering follows, because suffering thrives in confusion. Malevolence thrives in uncertainty. The moment you stop being able to distinguish truth from falsehood is the moment you become easy to control, easy to manipulate, easy to break. So what do? How do you fight this? The first step is to refuse to participate in the corruption of truth. Do not repeat what you know to be false. Do not say things you do not believe. If someone demands that you accept a falsehood, refuse. Even if it costs you, even if it makes you an outcast. Because the cost of compliance is much greater than the cost of resistance. You must be precise in your speech. If you allow your words to become vague, if you allow ambiguity to take hold, you open the door for deception. Clarity is your weapon against manipulation. The moment you allow words to be distorted, the moment you permit meaning to be rewritten, you have already lost. And finally, you must trust your own perception. If something feels wrong, if something seems distorted, do not ignore that feeling. Investigate it. Question it. Do not allow yourself to be bullied into accepting a false reality. The only way to combat deception is with truth. The only way to fight malevolence is with clarity. Because when truth is lost, everything is lost. There is a darkness in human nature that most people do not want to acknowledge. We like to believe that cruelty is an aberration, that evil is something external, something foreign, something that exists only in history books or in the minds of psychopaths. But that is not true. The capacity for cruelty exists in all of us. And there are those, whether through choice, through corruption, or through something even more sinister, who do not merely commit acts of harm, but who actively delight in the suffering of others. This is one of the clearest signs of malevolence. It is one thing to make mistakes, to act selfishly, or even to harm others out of ignorance. Those are the flaws of imperfect people, of people who struggle with their own weaknesses and failings. But to enjoy suffering, to take pleasure in the pain of another, that is something else entirely. That is a step beyond mere imperfection. That is an embrace of evil. You see this in many forms, some subtle and some overt. Think about the way people gossip, the way they revel in the downfall of others, the way they take a perverse satisfaction in watching someone struggle. It is a kind of parasitic pleasure, a way of elevating oneself by feasting on the misfortune of another. That is the seed of something dangerous, something that, if left unchecked, can grow into real cruelty. There is a reason why so many great stories, myths, and religious traditions warn against this kind of malevolence. In Christian theology, for example, the devil is often depicted as the one who seeks to destroy for the sake of destruction. He does not simply harm out of necessity or survival. He harms because he wants to. That is an important distinction. The worst forms of evil are not accidental. They are deliberate. They are joyful in their destruction. You see this in history, in the atrocities committed by those who did not merely follow orders, but who enjoyed inflicting pain. In every war, in every genocide, in every act of tyranny, there have always been those who found pleasure in the suffering they caused. These were not people who simply went along with evil. They embraced it. They laughed as they destroyed. They smiled as they tortured. They felt a thrill at the sight of another human being broken before them. And while those extreme examples may seem distant, may seem like something only monsters are capable of, the truth is far more unsettling. Because that same impulse, the delight in suffering, exists in everyday life. It exists in workplaces, in schools, in families. It exists in those who bully, in those who manipulate, in those who make it their mission to tear others down. Think about the person who relishes in making someone feel small. The boss who humiliates an employee, not because they must, but because they enjoy the power it gives them. The friend who subtly undermines you, who takes pleasure in your insecurities, who finds joy in your failures. The partner who does not just argue, but seeks to wound, to make you hurt in ways that go beyond the disagreement itself. Why do people do this? Why do some take pleasure in suffering? There are many reasons. Some do it out of resentment. They are bitter, angry, filled with jealousy, and instead of lifting themselves up, they seek to drag others down. Others do it out of a sense of power. When you cause suffering, you exert control. You become a god over someone else's pain. It is intoxicating. It makes them feel important. And some, perhaps the most dangerous of all, do it simply because they can. They are like children pulling the wings off flies. Not because they are angry, not because they seek revenge, but simply because they enjoy watching something squirm. This is why allowing cruelty to go unchallenged is so dangerous. When people take pleasure in suffering, they do not stop. They escalate. The more they get away with, the more they indulge. And before long, what starts as petty malice turns into something much worse. So what do you do? How do you deal with people like this? The first step is recognition. You have to see it. You have to be honest with yourself about what is happening. When someone repeatedly delights in hurting you, you cannot excuse it. You cannot pretend it is something else. There is no reasoning with malevolence. There is no redemption for someone who does not want to change. You must also refuse to participate. Do not let yourself become one of them. It is easy to be drawn in, to indulge in the same pleasure, to laugh when someone else suffers, to join the crowd that mocks the weak. But every time you do, you feed the very thing that destroys societies, that tears apart families, that corrupts individuals. You let that part of yourself, the part capable of cruelty, grow stronger. And finally, you must be willing to confront it. Malevolence thrives in silence. It thrives when good people look away, when they tolerate it, when they assume someone else will handle it. But that is how evil wins, not through the strength of the wicked, but through the inaction of the decent. If you see someone who delights in suffering, understand that you are not dealing with a normal person. You are dealing with something else, something that does not want what is good, something that has embraced destruction as a way of being. And the only way to stop it is to stand against it, because if you do not, it will spread. It will consume everything in its path. And one day, it will come for you too. Responsibility is the foundation of a stable and meaningful life. It is the mechanism through which individuals transform chaos into order, through which they build competence, develop integrity, and contribute to the well-being of themselves and those around them. Without responsibility, a person drifts, unmoored and aimless. And worse, when a person outright rejects responsibility, they become destructive. There are people who refuse to carry any genuine burden, who reject the idea that they are accountable for their actions, their words, or the impact they have on the world. And these people, in their refusal, invite suffering, not just upon themselves, but upon everyone around them. This is not mere laziness. It is not simple immaturity. The refusal to take responsibility is often a deliberate choice, an attempt to avoid the weight of existence while still demanding the rewards that come from those who do bear that weight. This is one of the signs of malevolence. Someone who shirks responsibility consistently, who offloads their burdens onto others while taking credit for success, is they corrupt the social contract that allows people to trust one another. They make life harder for those who do take responsibility because someone must always pick up the slack. And more dangerously, they create an environment where deception and manipulation flourish. You see this in everyday life. Think about the coworker who never pulls their weight on a project, but who is quick to accept praise when things go well and even quicker to blame others when things go poorly. Consider the friend who never acknowledges their role in conflicts, who always finds a way to twist the story so that they are the victim, no matter how much damage they have caused. Look at the family member who expects endless support and resources but never offers anything in return. These are not simply careless or forgetful people. They are people who have chosen to reject responsibility while still expecting to reap the rewards of those who accept it. One of the clearest indicators of this kind of corruption is the refusal to admit fault. A person who has no genuine responsibility will never truly say, I was wrong, I made a mistake, I should have done better. Instead, they deflect, they excuse, they shift blame onto others. If they are confronted, they might respond with anger, with self-pity, or even with manipulation, turning the situation around so that they are somehow the ones who have been wrong. This is a deeply dishonest way of being, and it erodes relationships, organizations, and societies. At the extreme, this kind of irresponsibility becomes outright parasitic. There are people who live entirely at the expense of others, who consume without contributing, who demand without giving. They do not build, they do not create, they do not support, they only take. And the more they are allowed to do this, the more entitled they become. They do not feel gratitude for what they are given, they feel owed. They do not appreciate sacrifices made on their behalf, they expect them. And the moment those sacrifices stop, they react with resentment, with outrage, with accusations of cruelty. This is what makes the refusal of responsibility so dangerous. It breeds resentment. A person who will not carry their own burden still feels the weight of existence pressing upon them, but instead of shouldering it themselves, they become envious of those who do. They look at people who are successful, disciplined, or competent, and instead of aspiring to be like them, they seek to tear them down. If they cannot build, they will destroy. If they cannot create, they will sabotage. They will criticize and undermine, seeking to level the playing field, not by rising up, but by dragging others down. You see this in ideological possession. Many dangerous ideologies are built on the rejection of personal responsibility. They tell people that their failures are not their own, that they are purely victims of an unjust system, that nothing they do can change their circumstances. And while there are genuine injustices in the world, systems that need reform, structures that create unfair disadvantages, the difference between truth and malevolence is this. Truth acknowledges hardship but encourages agency, while malevolence denies agency entirely. A person who accepts responsibility says, I have been given a difficult hand, but I will still do what I can. A person who rejects responsibility says, nothing is my fault, and therefore I am justified in my resentment, my destruction, my refusal to engage with reality. At its core, responsibility is what gives life meaning. The weight of obligation is not merely a burden, it is what makes us strong. When people take responsibility, genuine responsibility, for themselves, for their families, for their work, they become people who can be relied upon, who create stability, who bring order out of chaos. The more responsibility a person takes on, the more capable they become. And this is why those who reject responsibility are often weak. Not weak in a physical sense, but weak in character, in discipline, in resilience. They crumble at the first sign of hardship because they have spent their lives avoiding it. So what do you do when you encounter someone like this? The first step is recognition. You must see it for what it is. Do not make excuses for those who continually refuse to take responsibility. Do not let them convince you that their failures are always someone else's fault. Do not allow yourself to carry their burdens indefinitely, because when you do, you enable their corruption to continue. The second step is to set boundaries. You cannot fix someone who refuses to engage with reality. You cannot carry their burdens forever. At some point, you must let them feel the consequences of their own choices. And if they refuse to change, if they continue to manipulate, to evade, to blame, then the most responsible thing you can do is walk away. Because malevolence cannot survive without hosts. If you refuse to feed it, ultimately responsibility is not just a practical necessity, it is a moral one. The refusal to take responsibility is a rejection of truth, a rejection of meaning, a rejection of what it means to be fully human. And the only way to fight against it is to embody the opposite, to take on the burdens of life voluntarily, to tell the truth even when it is difficult, and to refuse to let malevolence disguise itself as innocence. There are people who do not seek to build, who do not strive for unity, who do not work toward mutual understanding. Instead, they seek to divide. They take what is whole and fracture it. They take what is peaceful and sow discord. And they do this not because it is necessary, not because it serves some greater truth, but because division benefits them. They thrive in conflict. They gain power through chaos. And they manipulate others by turning them against one another. This is one of the clearest signs of malevolence, when a person deliberately creates division where there was none. They do this in families, in workplaces, in friendships, in communities, and even on a national or global scale. They pit people against each other through subtle manipulations, whispered rumors, and manufactured grievances. Where there was once cooperation, they plant seeds of doubt. Where there was trust, they cultivate suspicion. One of the most effective ways they achieve this is by exploiting differences. They take natural variations, differences in opinion, background, status, or personality, and magnify them into sources of conflict. Instead of encouraging dialogue, they frame differences as irreconcilable. Instead of promoting understanding, they fuel resentment. They take minor disagreements and turn them into full-blown feuds. This is not accidental, it is calculated. People who create division often do so because it benefits them. In a divided environment, they gain influence. They set themselves up as the only ones who can be trusted, as the only ones who see the truth. They create factions, ensuring that loyalty is directed toward them rather than toward any shared values or common good. They make themselves indispensable, positioning themselves as the person who must be consulted, the person who must be followed. You see this in workplaces when someone spreads rumors about colleagues, creating tension that did not exist before. You see it in families when one member constantly stirs up drama, turning siblings against each other, making parents choose sides, ensuring that no one else has a stable bond except with them. You see it in friendships when one person subtly poisons the perception of others, leading to broken relationships based on nothing more than manipulation. On a larger scale, this is how nations collapse. Leaders who seek power through division do not unify their people, they fracture them. They convince one group that another is their enemy. They rewrite history to fuel grievances. They distort reality to create hostility. And once people are divided, they are easier to control. A unified society is strong, but a fragmented one is weak, vulnerable, and desperate for leadership. Even the leadership of the very person who caused the division in the first place. So how do you fight this? The first step is awareness. You must recognize when division is being artificially created. Do not take everything at face value. Question motives. Ask who benefits from the conflict. Do not allow yourself to be manipulated into turning against others without reason. Seek truth, seek understanding, and most importantly, do not let those who thrive on division control the way you see the world. There are forces in the world that do not merely ignore beauty, truth, and goodness, they despise them. This is something many people struggle to comprehend. They assume that if someone does something destructive, it must be out of ignorance, misunderstanding, or misguided intentions. But that is not always the case. There are those who, whether consciously or unconsciously, reject the very foundations of what makes life meaningful. They see something beautiful and want to defile it. They see truth and seek to distort it. They see goodness and feel compelled to corrupt it. Why? Because these things, beauty, truth, and goodness, are reminders of what is possible. They point toward an ideal, a higher standard, a better way of being. And for some, this is intolerable. If you are resentful, if you are filled with bitterness and anger, if you have chosen destruction over creation, then the very existence of these things feels like an accusation. A beautiful work of art, a sincere act of kindness, an undeniable truth. These things expose the lie that the world is only cruel, only meaningless, only broken. They remind people that something better exists, and for those who have embraced malevolence, that is unbearable. You see this hatred of beauty in those who deface, vandalize, or destroy things that inspire awe. They mock and trivialize what is sublime, reducing it to something ugly and ridiculous. They sneer at great art, at literature that has endured for centuries, at traditions that have brought people meaning. They call it outdated, oppressive, or irrelevant. Not because it is any of those things, but because they cannot stand the idea that something might be inherently valuable. You see the hatred of truth in those who distort facts, who manipulate narratives, who insist that there is no such thing as objective reality. They do not argue in good faith. They do not seek wisdom or understanding. They seek only to obscure, to muddy the waters, to ensure that nothing can be known with certainty. If truth exists, then falsehood exists, and they do not want that distinction to be made. They do not want accountability. They do not want responsibility, and so they reject truth altogether. And you see the hatred of goodness in those who mock virtue, who twist morality, who celebrate what is cruel and degrading. They tell you that kindness is weakness, that selflessness is foolish, that striving toward something noble is naive. They revel in corruption. They do not merely fail to be good, they actively seek to invert goodness, turning it into something laughable or contemptible. They want to believe that there is no real distinction between good and evil, because if they admit that goodness is real, then they must also admit that they themselves are wrong. This is why those who despise beauty, truth, and goodness are so dangerous. They are not simply misguided, they are actively working to unravel the very things that make life meaningful. And if they are allowed to succeed, all that is left is destruction, deception, and despair.